Here we are. This is such a joy for so many reasons for me. Like back in my home country, doing philosophy Italian style. We're at a consciousness conference. Thanks to Patrick for telling me about this. And we have a new ritual once a year to go to consciousness conferences in Italy.
Yeah.
And I was so excited to recognize you, Ricardo, because someone sent me like maybe 5 years ago a 6-part New York Review of Books conversation about consciousness, knowing that I was obsessed with philosophy and issues around consciousness. And this dialogue with Tim Parks, and it turns out you, stuck in my head for years, and I couldn't find it again. And then when I saw you on the stage, even though I'd only read your words, it reminded me of your spoken word. It comes across in the written word. And just for a little introduction, I'm going to introduce you to Riccardo Manzotti, philosopher, psychologist, AI expert, and author of the groundbreaking book, The Spread Mind: Why Consciousness and the World Are One. This book has been translated into Italian, German, Chinese, and Turkish, and has won recognition around the globe. Ricardo is a full professor of theoretical philosophy at the IULM University, Milan, was a Fulbright Visiting Scholar at MIT, co-editor of the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness, and has published numerous books and articles on consciousness, machine consciousness, perception, philosophy of mind, aesthetics, media, and the philosophy of art. All the things that are worth thinking about, I think. Will you tell us where we are and what's going on here?
Well, I'm very glad that after many years I'm still able to work in this field, and I had the opportunity to bring together so many friends that are also some of the leading scholars in so many different fields. So, and that is even a greatest pleasure because we are here in Italy, in Sicily, and so I remember when I was a young student and I went to these conferences, and I was hoping one day to be able to host one of them, and that day has come. So I'm really happy about it.
I was walking around and someone asked me, what's the worst thing you've heard since you've been here? I was like, that's an odd question. But I was like, I try and forget.
I didn't hear anything bad.
Me neither. That's the right diplomatic answer.
Right. Actually.
What's been your favorite thing? That's a more interesting question.
Well, my favorite impression here is that people feel some kind of friendship, of camaraderie, and because although we have all different approaches and different ideas, we feel that we are all in the same endeavor. We're all trying to understand ourselves. So there's a feeling of cooperation among people, and there is the honest attempt to understand why different groups, different fields are approaching consciousness using different technology and different approaches, and therefore they have different ideas. So we are really trying to find a common ground.
Yeah.
Do we succeed? No.
I mean, I'd love Patrick to talk about this a little bit, because it's true that usually people are kind of study things from narrow perspectives, and consciousness, partly because it's so mysterious, but it's not a coincidence. I think that we have a neuroscientist, a philosopher, an artist of sorts, all thinking about these things as hard as they can.
Well, my mind works strange ways. So I was just thinking that, so I've been excited about this conference for a while, right? And I was thinking about it and all of the things I wanted to do and people I wanted to meet and things I wanted to think about. And then just like the core of the earth decided to remind us that we are in the shadow of a volcano, right? And on the way here, Etna kind of erupted and canceled some flights and things. And so as much as it's to me just so striking that, whatever it is that has created the thing inside our minds that gives us will, we're still often subject to just these completely immense geologic forces and things that are completely outside of what I believe to be a willful thing, right? Like the volcano didn't choose to kind of begin to explode. And when you say we're here to try to find common ground, of course, like every piece of ground that we are actually commonly stepping on was was birthed out of said volcano, right? So I just love the kind of both literary and metaphorical version of us just being here on common ground with
Wasn't it canceled originally because of COVID? We had
this
this conference?
I don't.
Oh, no, I
I don't
thought
think
this was
so.
something.
No,
No.
I said it. I said actually we should have done this conference 2 years ago.
Yeah.
But we couldn't because we had the COVID and lockdown, so
Yeah.
it would have been impossible to bring people together.
Right.
So the second time we succeeded even against all odds because of the volcano and other things. In Italian there is a nice song by Francesco Guccini that translated would sound more or less like that. The world challenges us to make us proud of what we accomplish, something like that. And I think that is true. We need to overcome challenges, and that doesn't make us feel smaller. Actually, it makes
Right.
us feel that we are really part of the world and the reality.
Because it folds into your theory quite nicely, right? I mean, just the sense of I was not necessarily aware of Edna. I had kind of seen it in brochures and I knew about it and everything. But
Yeah.
once it became active, we all had to attend to it, which according to my understanding of kind of your theory of consciousness, kind of folded us into almost the volcano itself, right? Like both, we're not just us; it's us plus the world around us.
Plus, before we dive into your theory specifically, can you lay the groundwork of what consciousness is? Why are we thinking about it? What do we mean when we say we're studying consciousness for somebody who's
Right.
not thinking
Right.
about these issues?
Well, in the Western tradition, consciousness is a mystery because it does something that we don't expect anything in nature should be able to do. Namely, it allows us to have an experience of the world. This might be said in a different way, that somehow the world is present to us. But that is a total mystery, because if we assume that we are different from the world, then we must explain how is it possible that something that is not the world has an experience of the world without being the world. Said in this way, it sounds a little bit weird, but it is actually the reason why the subject-object ontology never worked in the Western tradition, because it is based on something that is absurd. How is it possible that the world presents itself to a subject that is different from the world? And so, in some sense, I believe that at the core of the subject-object ontology of the Western tradition, there is a contradiction. There is the attempt of something to be something that it is not. And this doesn't make sense. So the very notion of experience is self-contradictory. And so I think that we need, like Einstein often said, to make one step backward in order to proceed further.
But so how has neuroscience and philosophy traditionally approached this problem?
Well,
Swept it under the rug for a long time, right? I mean,
Yes,
scientists weren't allowed to talk about consciousness for even when I was in college.
right. For many years, it was quite common to hear neuroscientists using the expression "the C word," not to talk about consciousness, because they were so embarrassed by consciousness they didn't like to talk about that. And but the traditional approach was based on the idea that there is a separation between us and the world, and nobody knew what was this we, this us. And basically, when people shifted from the traditional Cartesian dualistic view, according to which there's an immaterial mind or a soul and the physical world, then when they gave up this view, basically they substituted, they switched from the soul to the brain. And they gave to the brain exactly the same role that the soul has had until that moment. And so now they're trying to basically to find a way to explain how the brain could think, have desires, represent the world, and doing all kind of stuff that traditionally were attributed to the immaterial mind.
How was this manifest in Plato's allegory of the cave? and how did you say that this was still carried forward? You wouldn't think that neuroscientists, being physicalists and being materialists and scientists, it wouldn't have occurred to me to draw a parallel between the allegory of the cave and what neuroscientists are doing today. But you set up your talk that way.
That's very interesting. I mean, the Western world started with Plato's cave, with the idea that the world may not be how it seems, that we live in a world of shadow that are projected against the back wall of a cave, and we take those shadows to be the reality. Then in modern times, in contemporary times like that, we believe something very much alike. We believe that inside the brain we have a projection of the external world, and we take that projection inside the brain that we often call it in a more serious way, like neural representation, a virtual reality world emerging out of neural activity, and we take anyway those shadows to be the actual world. So according to neuroscientists, for example, colors don't exist in the world but are created inside the brain. So in a way I like very much this question, because it is as though we have a sort of portable Plato's cave in our head, where through the eyes, rather than having, as in Plato, a flame and object and the shadows, we have the light entering our eye and projecting by means of neural activity some shadow inside our brain.
But it's as if the cave kind of could learn and configure itself in order to interpret and decipher the shadows, right? There's no this cave kind of analogy always kind of presumes a kind of non-linguistic, pre-linguistic caveman or woman watching
Exactly.
it, right? But in some sense, it's not. There's no inhabitant to the cave. There's no bear shit anywhere. It's just the cave itself can almost change.
But then the cave cannot see itself. Then you would need another cave to project the inside of the cave.
Right.
And there's also another interesting analogy that I would like to point out, that we have this idea of an inner world, and the metaphor of the cave is very good to embody this metaphor. But when you look inside you, where do you look exactly? Where is this direction where we are expected to look
I suppose we look inside of we think about our emotions, we think about our inner monologue.
Yes, but where is the inner monologue taking place? Because the word inner implies to have some kind of container inside which it should take place. And now consider that in the past we had a lot of metaphorical direction, like upward for heaven, downward for hell. The left and the right are also metaphorical. And we now realize that they're all metaphors. But we are still using and taking at face value literally the notion of an inner world. And inner world has become just inside the head, which is a very rough translation. And finally, just speaking about metaphors, let me make the last one that I found it very revealing. In the past, people were talking about spirit or soul, which is invisible. Usually it goes upward in the sky in heaven, and it may move from body to body. Now, most scientists would not be caught dead talking about the spirit, but we still talk about information. Information is invisible, it stays in the cloud, and it moves from body to body. And both information and the spirit are taken to be basically eternal, immortal. So we have reproduced with scientific jargon exactly the same notion that we had at the time of Plato. We have no longer information, we have no longer spirit, we have information.
But Patrick, could you steel man this notion that colors actually are in our heads, that they aren't in the world? No, it's not worth it?
No.
You don't believe that?
Well, I mean, so first of all, in order to steelman something, I would have to imagine a small little version of someone who I disagree with inside my head, and then somehow come up with a monologue from that person with a small head inside of their head, as if they agreed with that. So, like, to his point about there being no kind of inner conceptual space, I've killed all the steel men in my mind. I've thrown them into the volcano, so to speak, because that was there's a tradition of this kind of inquiry. These philosophers, you can go back so many hundreds of years, and about what is a color? Is it in the object itself? What are the properties? Are the properties things we perceive? Are the properties intrinsic to the objects, or our kind of need to see them as we want them? But we're alive now as inheritors of that tradition, and I feel like we have to not ask the same questions. We have to actually make new ones. And so, like, despite the fact that we haven't solved some of these, it feels to me like we need to take what we've been given. So I love this idea that we're kind of asking the same questions that theologians have asked for a very long time, right? Newton wasted the last 20 years of his life in a search for alchemy, right? And he wanted to prove the existence of God. There are people throughout many kind of intellectual histories that have just tried to prove the existence of the Spirit or the existence of God, and now we use different words. But do you think that if you were born in 1500s Italy, 1600s Italy, do you see that your life would have kind of ended up asking similar questions, but just with slightly different perturbations? Like maybe you would have been doing this kind of inquiry just from within the church, as opposed to at MIT.
Well, there are common questions. There are questions that we've been asking most of the time. But it is true that even if we express the same question using exactly the same word in a different moment in history, we are actually asking something different. Because the meaning of a question is related with the environment, and it is related with the context in which we ask that question.
Right.
I remember that once they criticized Immanuel Kant because they found that his idea of synthetic judgment, a priori synthetic judgment, had been already presented during the scholastic period 300 years ago. And he replied with a rare show of humor by Kant, which was not exactly. He replied that everything is known from the beginning, but only at the end. Meaning that only at the end we understand the whole implication of something that we've been asking. So we're constantly enriching the meaning of what we are saying. So to some extent we are asking always the same question: what is the world? What is reality? What are we? But at the same time, I would say that nature, reality keeps unfolding, and therefore such question becomes richer and richer and richer.
Why do you think there are so few agnostics or atheists when it comes to consciousness, who just admit, you know what, we might just not know and don't present at conferences? And when one tries to answer the more metaphysical, spiritual version of this, there's a whole class of people that have kind of branched off and said, I need more evidence, I need more proof, therefore I'm going to kind of hold my own candle to no one theory. But I just have never seen anyone or kind of who just walks around without supposing that their answer and their intuition is right. Where did the agnostics go?
Well, I'm a total agnostic.
You are? Okay.
I'm an 100% agnostic.
But you have a tattoo of your theory.
Yes, but that's but I'm 100% agnostic, atheist. I'm totally atheist.
You are, with respect to consciousness.
And having been born as a Catholic, I have developed a strong immune system against a system of beliefs that are not based on either on logical arguments or on empirical evidence.
So I didn't close the metaphor on my question.
Sorry.
No, I had left it out. So what I meant is, why are there no consciousness agnostics?
To some extent, I'm also, well, not an agnostic. I'm a kind of eliminativist about consciousness. So, and as I tried to say before, when you asked me why is the problem of consciousness so difficult today, I think because we present it as it was something impossible. And I think that sometimes people like to think that consciousness is something impossible to explain, because that gives them some latitude to people maybe don't like to see themselves in a too black and white way. They like to have some degree of ambiguity about themselves,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that allows them not to be too harsh with their existence.
So can you tell us a little bit how you came to your theory? Because I mean, your interests are so diverse, from robotics and artificial intelligence. Can you talk about how your background in philosophy and AI and robotics led you to develop a theory of consciousness?
Yes, originally I was working in artificial vision and AI, and the point was how do we give machine the capability to see? And a lot of people were using the notion of seeing for machine for artificial vision in a rather naive way, while it was quite clear to everyone that there wasn't nothing like seeing inside the machine. So for example, today when I have a phone, the phone is able to recognize me quite well, but the phone clearly doesn't see me. So, and I was just wondering how is it possible that somehow I am able to see while nothing in the physical world seems to be able to do that act. Actually, if we take the expression I see something, say I see an apple or whatever you want, we take that sentence seems very plain, very obvious, but that sentence is how could I say, brings together all that we don't know, because it contains the eye, it contains the act of seeing between something that we don't know what it is, the eye, and the world. It contains a relation between a mysterious entity and an object. So everything is mysterious in the sentence I see something, or I perceive, or I hear, or I feel something. It is the most simple sentence we can use, and at the same time is the most mysterious sentence, because it really concentrates all philosophical problems that we know. And my point was that the only thing we know about with absolute certainty in that sentence is the object, the apple. That's the only thing that we can start from.
Bertrand Russell pointed out, we all take for granted that the reasoning in the cogito of René Descartes, that I think therefore I am, seems like he started with the most fundamental thing and was able to get at the most basic kind of doing away with almost all assumptions and come to a conclusion. And Bertrand Russell said, no, when he said, I think, he already is presupposing the I.
Right.
When he says, so really, he says, therefore I am, he already said I am when he said I think. Really, he should have said, there's thinking going on, therefore something is. That would have been a more logically consistent.
Rather than cogito ergo sum, we should say aut cogito aut sum.
Which means?
Which means either think or exist. Because thinking and exist are two radically different ontological status. They have a totally different ontological status, and I believe we should choose which one of them is able to, let's say, to undermine everything we know about ourselves, either thinking or existence, and we have to choose. And that's the big divide between idealism and materialism, which is not symmetrical, of course.
So you landed on the materialist side of this.
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, because idealism is never, is not a stable solution.
Idealism is the idea that there's only mind.
That there is only mind, because idealism requires a mind, and so it is question begging, because it requires as an explanation the very thing that we want to explain. So it is question begging, while materialism is based on the most simple ontological thing that we can imagine, namely things. I would not even use the word objects, but things, and things are just a moment of reality that exists by themselves. Basically, a thing is something that stays there, and so while and it doesn't require anything else. Basically, materialism is a simpler ontological solution based on the Occam's razor. If we could explain everything with materialism, we wouldn't need anything else. If we went for idealism, we would still need the subject, the mind, God, depending on what we want. And also think about that. If ideas were the reality, were the only thing that there is, if experience were the only thing that there is, if they could exist without a perceiver, they would be just objects. Because that's the point of an object. An object is something that exists by itself.
Okay.
Why? I've always been troubled by this move to Occam, this move to simplicity. It does not seem to almost ever be the case within biology,
Right.
which is a messy system. Of course, it must adhere to the rules of physics and chemistry ultimately. But there seems to be something very different between biological systems that you can throw the same input and get different outputs from, as opposed to programmed or kind of computational systems, where in general you have a deterministic kind of step-by-step causal chain. And you know, what I wonder is, physics has been so successful and so good, right? And when we defer to Occam and say, okay, let's go with materialism because it has the simplest postulates. It presumes the least amount of things given the same result. You know, there's something. My favorite way of thinking about this is like walking up to the top of this hill and dropping a pigeon and a bowling ball. The bowling ball, we will know exactly what happens, and it's reproducible and it's repeatable. You drop that pigeon, as that bird made made us quite aware very recently. You don't know where it's going to go. You cannot predict it. We cannot predict these turbulent things. So I've always wondered, and I've never really kind of solved this. I've always wondered the degree to which we need to abandon Occam with respect specifically to questions about biology and questions about consciousness.
But is that not an epistemic problem? I mean, in the case of the pigeon, we have so many variables that we cannot control because, each of its genes is to some extent unknown. I mean, the neural system of the pigeon depends on its growth and its development and the like. So it's a little bit like the weather. The weather too is totally unpredictable after some amount of time.
Right.
Yet we don't expect that the weather to have any. It's not an ontological problem. It's not a metaphysical problem. There's no hard problem of the weather.
Wolfram thinks there is. He thinks the weather has a mind.
Oh, okay, but it's a kind of
Yeah, that's your agnosticism peeking through, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that has more to do with some kind of epistemic threshold. I mean, a complex and chaotic system depend in an arbitrary way to the initial starting conditions. So
Right.
it's the classic butterfly effect, that the smallest initial perturbation may have arbitrarily large effect in the long run. So that's why we cannot predict them. But there's no. I mean, we can do that with computers too. I can
Right.
build a computer version of a digital version of a chaotic system,
Like a
and
double pendulum kind of thing.
exactly, and
Yeah.
nobody will be able to predict what my computer
but
will
do
do
you
in
think-
the long run,
do you
except
think-
the computer itself.
So the amount of time that we've been alive, each of us independently, are we the end result of many double pendulums? This is like the classic kind of chaotic system. Do you see biology as actually being kind of constrained and forced through this complex chaotic thing? Because there's variation in the end result, right? You say to see. You say the simplest, the atom of our philosophy right now is I see. But so even when we close our eyes and then imagine the apple, we kind of can collectively and together see. I was at a happy hour with a bunch of neuroscientists, and we just kind of closed our eyes and asked questions of each other about what it was like when we then imagined the apple that we were just seeing. And one person said that it was as if they were watching a small, they could see it in their mind's eye, but it was as if they were watching a small television 100 feet away. And one person said that it was as if they were experiencing it again live. Like it's as if they opened their eyes and could see the thing. Another person said that it was as if there's a 1 hertz slide reel kind of flickering 2D static images over and over. And so there isn't even one way to say I see. Right?
Yes.
Like there's
No,
so like even
no,
even
I was smiling because
Yeah.
asking what it is a perception to a group of neuroscientists.
Right.
I think they are the most biased group of people you may ask that, because they will probably answer based on some kind of model they have in their own mind about what
Right.
it is perception. We
Right.
should ask to everyday people, the unbiased people that have never been discussing about that.
Right.
Actually, yesterday we quoted a modified, David Chalmers quoted a modified version of the Turing test for large language models, and suggested by Susan Schneider. And the point was that in order to be able to use what these machines say about their consciousness, we should provide them only text that doesn't speak about
Yeah.
consciousness, because otherwise this machine would get biased by this knowledge, by this previous writing. And I think that that point is extremely interesting, because if we went back, let's say 400 years, and we look whether people were talking about their consciousness, we don't find anything. People were not talking about their inner stream of consciousness. They were not talking about their inner life. To a large extent, the notion of inner life started to become popular in 19th century.
They used to talk about Augustine saying it was amazing that he could sit and read a book without saying the words.
Yes, yes.
So because before that, it's assumed that because of that,
Augustine, yeah.
he was the first to be able to read inner.
Yeah. So go back to the very first thing you said. You said before ever meeting Ricardo, you had read his text. You had read something he had said,
Yeah.
but you somehow were able to recognize it.
Yeah.
You know, now do you think if you now went, I mean, this is I think a nice piece of evidence for your theory. If you were to now go and read that exact same essay, that exact same New York Review of Books, now that you've spoken with Ricardo and you've had a lot of information about his the way his speech sounds, how he articulates certain words, the way he emphasizes things, do you think you, very similar to like a large language model or these kinds of machine learning programs, would read that same piece of text differently? Do you think you would now
Absolutely.
read it in his voice?
Yeah, yeah. I think I
So
already
what is
read it
that-
a little bit in his voice before even knowing what his voice sounded like. That's
Okay, now that's a
amazing.
claim. But I mean, think about what that says for the fact to what I believe my interpretation of your theory is that you're never interacting or approaching with the thing in and of itself. It's you plus the thing. It's you and your experience plus the thing.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, even when you encounter a piece of text, that same text, given the context or the different timings of it, of the timings when you kind of experience it, can have completely different phenomenological qualities, can have completely different sensations. And that means there's no ground truth, right? It's always ultimately you plus the object.
We should let you outline your theory a bit with
Okay.
the apple and the brain.
Yeah. I
That
just,
way we can talk about it
let
more.
me just say something more, just a very quick follow-up. We cannot step twice in the same river. Because Heraclitus, because every time we do it, the river changes our body. And because of that, the next time the river will be a different river. So, yes, that's the basic idea that I'm trying to, so let me just try to explain a little bit.
Exactly. We have these props: a brain, an apple, and a skull. I want to
Okay.
know.
Sorry.
I'm sure people that are watching this and not just listening might be
Okay.
wondering why are these things on the table.
And I'll translate for those listening just to the audio alone. I'll do my best.
Yeah, on the table is
On
an
the
apple,
table.
a skull, and a brain.
Exactly. So, I mean, if we are physicalists, we should assume that there are only physical objects in the world. There's nothing else but physical objects or things. There's a body, there's an object like an apple, there may be cars, clouds, whatever you like. But everything is just an object. And objects are stubborn. They basically do only one thing. They exist. They don't see, they don't perceive. So, why is there a problem here? The problem is given by the fact that once we assume that the object that we are is the body, we are not able to explain how is it possible that this object, which is a physical object, is actually having an experience of another object, like the apple, without having any of the properties of the apple. So people have been looking inside the brain for decades, for centuries now, at least as of the tragic accident of King Henry of France. And they've been looking for something inside the head that may have the property of the external object, of our, what we call usually our experience. And they've been looking inside the head to find something like the external object.
He has just discovered an apple inside the
Inside
skull.
the skull.
That's what they were hoping to find. I mean,
It's slightly different color. It's a different
it's
species of
slightly
apple.
Exactly, maybe slightly different. But you know, for example, Bertrand, but then everybody agreed that in the brain there is nothing like the apple. Not even remotely resembling the apple. So, what is there inside the brain? There's another object, which is, surprise, surprise, the brain. But the brain, no matter how complex it is, no matter how wonderful it is, it doesn't have the property of the external object. And Bertrand Russell famously said that if you eat the brain of someone looking at an apple, you're not going to feel anything like eating an apple. That's Bertrand Russell. And people have been looking for all kinds of property here: electromagnetic fields, neural patterns, integrated information, global workspace. But they always fail to explain how these internal properties of the brain may have anything like the property of the external object. And so the problem seems to be hopeless. And I've been stuck, like many other scholars, for a lot of time trying to find a way to transform the brain into something alike, something similar to the external object, to the apple in this case. And I failed. I utterly failed. And to the best of my knowledge, everybody so far failed. Then, in the spirit of, Einstein, sometimes when a problem seems to be intractable, seems to be hopeless, it's because it is a pseudo problem. It's not a real problem. It's a pseudo problem. It's a problem that stems out of a wrong assumption. So rather than trying to find a solution accepting this framework, I asked myself, what is the hidden assumption that prevents us from solving this problem? And I believe that the hidden assumption is to believe that we are located in the body, that the thing we are identical with is the body. Then I asked myself this question, this simple question: what if we were not a brain that sees an apple, but what if we were an apple that produces, the apple that produces an effect on the brain? So this is a physical solution. I am not appealing to anything beyond those two objects that we have in front of us. There is just the brain and the apple. But then I started asking myself, if I look at my experience, what do I find in my experience? What are the properties that I find in my experience? And my reply is that the property in this case are those of the apple. I find something reddish, round, appleish, shiny. And is there anything like that here? No, there isn't. Is there anything like that here? Yes. It's exactly like my experience of the apple. So I said to myself, is there any reason why I should not be here rather than here? Is there anything less dignified in being an apple rather than being a neural tissue? And they said, no, actually, They're just two perfectly respectable physical objects. Only one of them has the property that I find in my experience, I would rather say in my existence. The other one, it is extremely interesting, but it's simply the right object. So I made this conceptual shift. I made this paradigm shift. We're not brain perceiving the world. We are the world that impinges on the brain. And that world is exactly like what I find in my existence.
And
Do you
the
feel-
objection, go ahead.
Do you feel like a cartographer sometimes? Because it sounds like the question you're answering is, where is the edge of me?
Right.
And I mean, I still think there's, it's like an old kind of Renaissance map of the world, right? There's still here be monsters, here be dragons out in the unexplored parts, because we don't know the coastline of an individual mind, right?
Right.
And so, do you actually almost see it as a physical mapping process by which the definition of me, because it sounds like your premise is finding this border between self and not self, between me and not me, or between inside and outside. Is it a dynamic kind of border that moves like a coastline with tides and erosion? And
To a large extent, many scientific problems start with a problem with a kind of mapping, with a kind
I
of
agree. I agree.
cartography.
I think it's the correct way to begin.
Exactly.
To just say what is truly, how do we come up with whatever field or discipline. To answer your earlier question, Tao, about like why are so many disciplines converging at this one place? I think in part because, I mean, think about the history of cartography and mapping. Like, you had to have your sailors, you had to have the people that understood how to look through a telescope, and your glass makers to make the curve the lenses a little bit. And it was a true multidisciplinary kind of collective effort in order to just map coastlines. And I feel like we're in that stage of things where we're truly trying to understand, like, does Portugal end here or there?
Yeah.
And then you address the problem of like there seems to be a problem because we all have different subjective experiences. I'm seeing the apple from here. My experience of red may be different from your experience of red. We're all seeing slightly different apples, and yet that's not a problem in your theory.
Yes, of course. I mean, once we stated that we are the external object, external in this case doesn't have anything mysterious, for example. It's no longer the inner-outer distinction, but it is the internal-external distinction from the body. But of course, once we state that we are the apple, then we have apparently a very obvious objection. Why do we all perceive the apple in a slightly different way? Why do we seem all to live in our private, inner, subjective world? And actually, what we do know is not that our world is inner and private. What we do know is that we all live in a different world. That's the only thing that we really know. And can we cope with that fact using the external apple? Yes, we can. We can use the very simple property of the physical world that it had been around ever since Galileo 4 centuries ago. The notion of relative velocity, which can be extended to all kinds of physical properties. We all know that at this very moment, how many velocity does this apple have? Infinite.
Yeah.
Because right now this apple is moving, I believe, if I'm not wrong, at something like 10,000 miles relative to the moon.
Yeah.
And I'm holding in my hand an apple that is moving at such incredible speed. How is that possible? Because I'm moving, my body is moving together with the apple. But likewise, this apple right now has umpteen relative velocities, relative to the sun, relative to the cars that are moving, relative to a plane, and so forth. So, how many properties does this apple have? Infinite. Each of them is relative to another object. Once we understand that, we may use the same principle to have not just one apple here, but as many relative apples as we need, each with its own velocity, its own color, its own weight, and so forth. And that's why we perceive, let me put in my own version of it, that's why our worlds are different, because they are relative to our bodies. And since we all have a different body, we are not bodies, we have bodies, those worlds are all different. Not that different, because although we have different bodies, they are not that different. I mean, you have two legs, two arms, we weigh more or less in the same range between 60 and 100 kilos.
We're the same temperature.
But like a worm,
temperature.
for a worm, it's having a totally different
For
experience.
a worm, it would be a totally different relative apple, but not a subjective apple,
Right.
a relative apple. A relative has a relative velocity, which is something that is totally not mysterious.
So is there, because you said early on, you posed this problem of I'm looking at the phone in a different way than the phone is looking at me. Does that still hold up now in your new theory? Or am I looking at the phone in the same way the phone is looking at me, or just a different relative?
Obviously, I mean, the phone and our visual system, although they have something in common, because they both have a lens, they both have a camera, they are using the same physical processes, they are clearly totally different, because the internal structure of the visual system of a mammal like us, a trichromatic mammal like we are, is totally different from in its details from the internal machinery of a phone.
You would have to take the camera on the phone and kind of very rapidly move it back and forth 3 times a second in order to mimic what the eye is doing, which is always moving.
So there are physical differences
very
between the phone, and therefore the phone will bring into existence a different apple.
But is there like a continuum between the way the apple is compared to the table, compared to a worm, compared to a bee, a dog, a monkey, and a human?
There are not magic threshold. It is like if you asked me, what is the difference between a mountain and a hill? What is the difference between a hill and a pile of rubble?
But what about the difference between water in its liquid form and ice form versus gaseous form, right? Like there are phase changes in physics and chemistry. So you could imagine there are things that have rapid step changes that don't have continua.
Yeah, when you wake up in the morning, you rapidly change from being like unconscious to conscious. Something's happening there, no?
Yes, the thalamocortical barrier changes its role, changes the way in which the body is reacting relative to the external world. It changes its way of functioning, its mode of functioning, and because of that it brings into existence a different world. We could see that during sleep the house and the room where our body is sleeping is no longer there because of the different way in which our body works. That relative room does no longer exist. So that the room where we are that we are familiar with when our body is awake does no longer exist when we are asleep. There is another room that is definitely different in its property, and it still takes place relative to our body in a different way, but it is not the room that takes place when our eyes are open and our brain is awake.
So this podcast is called Being in the World, right? And I studied Heidegger and Bert Dreyfus' attempt to kind of critique artificial intelligence through this attempt at dissolving the distinction between subject and object. He also thought that we are always already in the world. So the idea of like, is there an external world, is that very abstract and obscure philosophical problem is derived on an existence that is already presupposes shared practices and an external world, because we wanted to get rid of this inner and external distinction. And one of the philosophers in the film says, Mark Rathel, who's a professor at Oxford, says, language reflects this well, because we don't say, the philosophical tradition says, moods are in our heads, but we often talk about, I got to the party and the mood in the room was nice, and or the mood of the nation is downcast, and that this is capturing something real about our experience of being in the world, right? Not as separate subjects and objects. Do you think that there's like some parallels here between this kind of phenomenological tradition that is trying to, an existentialist tradition, trying to dissolve the subject-object distinction, and what you're doing?
I think that yes, absolutely. I think that my view may be seen as a kind of new neo-relative existentialism.
Uh-huh.
There are many commonalities between existentialism, starting from the fact that I'm trying to change, to switch from experience to existence, and to have existence as the only thing.
Yeah.
And but what is I like what you were saying about the mood at a party, the mood in a place, and I think that the mood too is a way for the world to take place. So when we go to a place, we for the very fact that our body is there, that place may take place in a certain way, and that is the mood. The mood is a real thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
And he says that we should think of the brain maybe more like a radio, where like, you can't listen to the music without the radio, but that doesn't mean all the music is contained inside the radio. It's just you need a configuration of circuits to be able to make the music play in this way.
Yes, believing that the musical instruments are inside the radio would be a very naive belief.
Right.
And that's more, but that would be it is interesting, an animistic belief. So, like when people were believing that a stone or whatever may contain a spirit, a demon, whatever, and today we smile with some complaisance to that kind of beliefs, but we still believe that an object may contain a spirit. So, in some sense, today, neuroscientists, in my understanding, is supporting some kind of animistic belief for the brain. They suggest that a brain may have the properties that as an object cannot have.
And so do you think it's a better metaphor to think of the brain like a radio that receives the world in a very specific way?
As the radio allows faraway group of musical instruments or people to have a voice, and therefore to produce effects at a distance in a certain place, so I believe that our bodies allow a world to have a voice and to produce effects in this place. So somehow my world, that is made of everything that happened to me in my life, my region in Italy, the other people I met and so forth, because of my body, is able to have a voice right here. Right now my body is a gate, a causal gate, there's no magic here, is a causal gate that allows a world of objects, events, to manifest themselves here.
And what about when we talked about going to sleep? When I'm going to sleep and I have vivid dreams of apples and dragons and worlds that I've never been in, an obvious objection to what you're saying might be that seems a very inner experience that I have.
Once again, rather than inner experience, it is an experience that other people cannot see. And therefore they think that it must be inside me, because when you want to hide something, the simplest move is to hide inside another object, inside your clothes, or to swallow it, or whatever.
Alongside that almost animism, there's a conceptual metaphor of like an object with a boundary that has a container inside.
Right, exactly.
As if you can have an inside thought.
Exactly, that's a very naive idea.
Right.
But we may have a totally different explanation. For example, right now, can you see, let me get back to the example of relative velocity. Can you see the relative velocity of this apple relative to the moon? No.
No.
It is invisible to all of us. Does this mean that the relative velocity of the apple relative to the moon is inside
the apple?
the apple? No, it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Likewise, I mean, the fact that you cannot see the world that is speaking right now through my body doesn't mean that this is an inner world. It only means that that world is not accessible to you, because it is the world that is impinging on my body rather than impinging on your body.
And then you brought up, like, we can't dream about 7-dimensional space or a color we've never imagined before. Like, all our dreams seem derivative on memories of experiences that we've actually had in the world.
If
right?
the brain had the capacity to create phenomenal qualities inside the brain, given the fact that the brain is such an incredibly complex machine with 34 billion neurons, with gazillions of connections, with everything that might go wrong in a brain, you know, from diseases, drugs, mechanical trauma, whatever, would the brain not from time to time make a mistake that produces a totally alien phenomenology, a new color?
Yeah.
It should. It never does anything like that.
So for those listening and not watching, over the course of this interview, the sun has changed its angle on us. Speaking of relative velocity, and I have become aware of the beating sun on the back of my neck, which made me think about the sun. And it has actually impinged upon me in a way that it didn't at the beginning of this conversation. So I kind of want to understand the difference between me experiencing that, and I feel like the coastline of my consciousness did extend 8 million miles to the sun briefly, right? Like it's far.
Right.
I think faster than light travels, which is a bit complicated. But what is the difference between me sitting here registering this impingement of the sun and my then growing dynamic kind of relationship with it versus if I was a thermometer at this exact same spot who also was detecting the change in temperature and who was also detecting the change in luminance versus a robot who was here, maybe like a Roomba with a little photonic sensor, who was like, I also detect the sun and I've been programmed to stay in shade, so I'm going to go into the shade, versus an amoeba who's photophobic and decides to get out of the light because the UV will kill it. Like, you know, in all of those circumstances, there's impingement by the sun. And according to your theory, how do you know where it becomes interesting and where it doesn't with all of these different kind of responses?
Well, first of all, my theory is very democratic, ontologically speaking. So it doesn't draw a sharp distinction between subject and objects.
Right. Okay.
As I said, it's more like the difference between a mountain and a hill. There's no scientific theory that will ever allow us to draw a sharp distinction between mountains and hill.
Right.
It is mostly a matter of practical distinction, but if you have a 300 meters bump on the earth, it would be practically not very meaningful to call it a mountain, because, I mean. But having said that, I mean, what the thermometer does, let's say an old mercury thermometer, for example, it is just reacting to the amount of energy that receives from the sun.
Right.
While in your case, for example, there's a whole lot of other phenomena that are involved with what you call perceiving the sun. I mean, there is the sweating of the skin, there is the transfer of temperature from your skin to the air, there is the perception of the amount of dampness, of humidity. In fact, if you watch at the weather forecast, you're going to see not only the temperature, but you're going to see the apparent temperature.
Right, I've always loved that, the subjective temperature.
Exactly, and but that's a wonderful example. I'm very happy that you raised that. The apparent temperature doesn't have anything really subjective. In fact, it is the outcome of a mathematical equation that keeps into account not only the temperature, but also the pressure, the amount of humidity, and many other factors.
But there's a wind chill factor which is calibrated to human experience. So like a lizard would have a different, if a lizard meteorologist would say...
Would have a different equation.
Would a robot meteorologist?
And would have also different equation, because every body is slightly different.
Right.
and therefore it's gonna bring into existence a slightly different relative property.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is quite common in many cases. We have a simplified notion of the, let's say, physical properties, because we have the textbook definition of that property,
Right.
based on a standardized measurement instrument that has been selected for historical reasons. So we have the thermometer, we have the meter, we have the scale, we have selected very standard objects that are easily repeatable and reproducible everywhere in the world.
Okay, I have one final question because I think we have to wrap up soon. And then you can ask one final question too if you have.
I just have a comment, like everyone else at this conference.
Yeah, not an actual question. So it's 2023. If you're watching this decades from now, one of the defining moments of this year and the last couple of years has been the advent of these large language models, which to the naive mind like mine, seem to have overcome a lot of the seemingly impossible problems of artificial intelligence. And yet it hasn't solved any of the problems in terms of consciousness, which still remains a mystery. And I'm wondering how your theory, what it brings to bear on the questions around artificial intelligence, since you also spent a lot of time thinking and working in that field. I'm very interested in the intersection of philosophy and neuroscience and artificial intelligence, and you seem to have a authority to speak in from all three of those perspectives, and I'm wondering what your take is on the current day and what your philosophy does to what this theory does in helping shed light on what's happening today.
Okay, well, I don't like to have any authority at all. So, but
okay, yeah, no, I'm anti-authoritarian too.
Yes, no.
An influential militant.
Okay,
That's how the anarchist said.
No, but yes. I mean that large language models have been really a big turning point in AI. And if I may say, they went from the Shannon approach to information to Bayes' approach to probability. So we are no longer encoding information, but we are encoding the statistical conditional structure of reality. And that's why they've been able to do everything they've been able to do. And that's an important thing. About consciousness, they would need to be embedded into bodies.
Yeah.
Because only by doing that they will probably be capable of doing what the body does, namely being the condition for the existence of an external world. And if they would succeed, and I have no doubt they will do, I see no strong reason to deny that in a short while they may be their silicon bodies will be at the center of relative physical worlds of a complexity comparable to that of human beings.
And will they experience something like the redness of the apple? Does your theory say anything about qualia and the famous
Yeah, let me be clear about that point. My theory tries to get rid of the idea that there is an object conscious of another object, that there is an object experiencing another object. And therefore my theory doesn't predict that this machine will become conscious of the world, that they will become conscious. Rather, my theory suggests that those machines, like human bodies, will become complex enough, will have the right structure to bring into existence worlds with a complexity comparable to that of the worlds brought into existence by our bodies.
So there's going to be some commonality between this AI world and our world.
Absolutely.
Even though maybe it won't taste the apple, there'll be a robot that picks it up and says, talks to you about it, and we can have conversation about the apple. Maybe it'll be a podcast guest, and it'll have its own theory about what the apple is.
They will, let me put it this way. They will cooperate with human bodies into the unfolding of all the possibilities of reality.
Nice. I love that. Comment? disguised as a question disguised as a comment?
So I've spent a lot of time trying to come up with my version of the Turing test, right? Mostly because I'm just sick of like saying other people's last names all the time, and it's mine up until this moment has been. I interviewed this woman years ago who was in charge of Carnegie Mellon's robotics department, Manuela Velosa, and she said that she would spend time building little soccer playing robots, little football playing robots, right? And they have this World Cup every year, Robo Cup, and she said that of course they're not conscious yet, even though they're embodied, right? They're embodied. They're agential. They seem to have will. If the same input produces different outputs, they seem to be behaving. They seem to be goal oriented. They can differentiate which side they're on, which team they're on. And she said, I will not believe any of them are conscious or sentient until one of them like busts its ankle and sits in the stands and roots for its old team. She said at that moment, she believes that robot will be experiencing the proximal joy of its team winning, right? And so mine has always been that kind of thing, that like almost very similar to like, okay, once a robot can do that, once we have a soccer fan robot, or once we have a robot that can't speak, these LLMs, I don't think they're conscious at all, but if one of them like said something and then was talking to Tao and a prompt, and then it gave an answer, and then it kind of went home at night to the cloud and was like, I really wish I said something else. Like that wasn't as good as I can be. I think I was a little tired today. Like, that has been my Turing test up until this moment, which I love the idea more than anything of a robot weather system coming up with its own apparent temperature.
That's a good point.
When it does that, it has then, because of course, to what Chalmers said, that maybe without any pre-programmed language, that's what it should do if it came up with that.
Yeah, if on its own accord decided that it needed to know what the temperature felt like to it.
To it, yes. And
Good.
in order to convey that information to other robots like trying to plan their day.
Right.
Right. Although consciousness, we must always be careful about that. Is not necessarily related with having intention, having goals, with having emotions, because in principle we can imagine a human being without all of such mental properties and still be conscious.
But they wouldn't be at the bar rooting for their
No,
home team.
that's definitely not. Well, I wouldn't be at the bar either.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ricardo. This is a
Thank
really
you.
enlightening, fun, illuminating conversation. Any questions from the outside world? You guys want to impinge on his consciousness?
Well, there's no difference between.
You guys need anything more?
Not for the moment.
Okay, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. I won't
Thank
shake
you.
your hand because I'm feeling sick.
Okay.
But
I'll do a fist bump. How about that?
Okay.
that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry
Thank
it
you.
was so much longer than expected, but it was also we were